Number 1. It was a stupid mistake. Wandering into the desert that made up a portion of Route 111 with Go goggles was a stupid mistake. Pokemon trainer Brent wholeheartedly regretted his foolish decision. He was cocky, convinced it wasn't as bad as the stories portrayed. Even his close friend warned him of the danger, and the mysterious horde of creatures who preyed upon the foolish who entered their territory. It was probably just a band of rogue Pokemon he could easily dispatch with his Crawdaunt. Still, Brent regretted his decision immensely as he drained the last dregs of warm water out of his canteen. Sand was swirling all around him, chafing his skin and entering his eyes, mouth, ears, any opening on his body. Brent was blind, unable to see anything but the ever-shifting sands. He wasn't even sure how long he'd been wandering, or where he was. All he knew was that it was late afternoon, judging by the sun's position and the dropping temperature. Behind him, through the whistling of the sand in his ears, Brent swore he heard the shuffling of feet and low cackling. He whipped around quickly, only to see the still silhouettes of oddly shaped cacti on the horizon. Shrugging, Brent continued his trek, unaware of where he was going or the true danger that lurked in the sand. He walked and walked, traversing the desert in hopes of finding someone or something that could help him back to the stable ground. Occasionally, Brent saw shapes, swiftly navigating through the sands surrounding him. The creatures? No, they must simply be mirages. Deserts were prone to producing such in weary travelers. Wandering aimlessly, endlessly. Brent was dragging his feet across the land, not caring his shoes were filling with sand with every step. His foot caught on something, and he tripped, landing face first in the abrasive sand. Sitting up, he sputtered, coughing out sand in the process. A harsh wind blew, taking the sand with it, and revealing exactly what Brent tripped over. He almost lost it. It was a human body. It was a skeleton, more like it, its bones picked clean. Brent backed away quickly, scrambling to his feet. He vowed that there was no way he was going to end up like that. He wasn't going to die here. There was so much more he had to accomplish. He hadn't even earned his 4th badge yet. That was what Brent was on his way to do, until the desert proposed to be a larger obstacle than originally expected. Nevertheless, night fell quickly, both the high winds and the temperature dying down. Brent fortunately found a suitable place for rest, right along the edge of a sheer cliff face, worn away by the rough sand. He was sure this designated one of the ends of the desert, and was sure it would lead him to the end eventually. But, as of now, Brent was exhausted and desperately needed sleep to conserve his energy. Ignoring his nagging thirst and hunger, Brent laid down on a sleeping bag his mother made sure he packed. As soon as he shut his eyes, Brent heard the memorable shuffling and cackling noises. He shot up and looked around. Only cacti. Eerily familiar cacti seemed to be stalking him around the desert. Filled with unease, Brent tried futilely to get rest. The noises increased in volume, and the shadowy cacti moved closer. Brent nervously fingered the Pokeball in his belt, his trusted Crawdaunt inside. Before he could even send out his Pokemon, the cacti were surrounding him, the moonlight highlighting their terrifying features. Their golden eyes glinted maliciously, and the gapes in their heads were shaped into evil grins. They were Pokemon, Cacturn, Brent recognized. Still, just because he knew what they were didn't mean he could stop them. The desert trek had worn him out. In an instant, the Cacturn were upon him, tearing at tender flesh with sharp needles. Brent screamed, although it was pointless. It's not like there was anyone around for miles to hear. He was silenced soon enough. The Cacturn ate well that night, deciding to rest near the discarded corpse. They were too full to still remain active, even when dawn broke. But when night fell once more, they picked their next victim to stalk. Just like Brent, they didn't see it coming. Number 2.
Do what? I think we're lost, Mina told her companion. They could hear the torrential rain and thunder outside, the same storm that knocked out the power in the entire Celestial Tower and the surrounding area. All Mina wants to do is to at least find the front door, so she can leave as soon as it clears up. She scolded herself for not bringing another source of light with her into the tower. There's nothing we can do but wait till morning, Mina mentioned, sitting down and leaning against what Mina hoped was the wall. Let's just try and get some sleep.
Do.
Her Duat answered, sitting down beside her. After numerous unsuccessful attempts to get some sleep, Mina just sat where she was, idly petting her sleeping Duat and checking the time on her X transceiver every few minutes. That's when she noticed a purple flame nearby, like the flame of a candle, and it seemed to be moving towards her. Mina was instantly alert, her hand instinctively going to the Pokeballs attached to her waist. She didn't throw one. She wanted to be sure that whatever it was had hostile intentions before attacking. As it came to where she was, she could see in the darkness its purple light, that it was indeed a living candle.
Litwick.
It said, its eyes looking over Mina and Duat. Mina noticed, as it came close, that this Pokemon was a light source. Though not as bright as a light bulb, it was enough to lead them out, but only if it was willing. "Hello," Mina said as kindly as possible. "We got kind of lost in the darkness. Do you think you could help us by leading us to the door?"
Litwick.
It answered, nodding. Mina woke up Duat, who was initially suspicious of the candle Pokemon and was ready to attack. But after Mina told him that Litwick agreed to lead them out, he calmed down and allowed the candle to lead the way. Initially, Litwick used its light to make sure they took the right path and didn't trip, as well as leading them through the maze of gravestones to the stairs. But as they went, it became harder and harder until both Mina and Duat were breathing heavily. After a bit more, Duat suddenly fainted. "Litwick, come over here. I need your light to check on Duat," she called to the Litwick. It turned and came back, and Mina was able to see that he didn't just faint. It was more like his energy was sapped. Duat, can you hear me?" Mina called, shaking him. Duat managed to weakly open his eyes halfway, and Mina breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he would be okay. But he shook his head and said,
Do.
He closed his eyes again, as his body took a few more difficult breaths, and then laid still. Tears came to Mina's eyes as she realized that her Duat, her beloved Pokemon that she had had since Juniper gave him to her as a present, was dead. She picked up his body, intending to give him a proper burial come morning. After another floor, Mina fell to her knees. She struggled to stand, but it was as if her energy had left her, and she didn't have enough to even get to her feet. She looked at the Litwick she was following, which now had a sinister smile on its face. Mina gasped as she suddenly realized that the Litwick had been sapping her energy, and was the reason Duat was dead. She brought a hand to her belt, intending to use one of her other Pokemon, but Litwick jumped forward with surprising speed and knocked her on her back, scattering her Pokeballs everywhere. It sat on her chest, and the sinister yellow eyes would be the last thing she would see, as her remaining energy was sapped. Litwick stepped away from the now dead human. As it walked off, it stopped and looked back at her. It kind of liked her, and it was sorry it killed her. But it needed to eat as well, and the human was the closest thing around. It was full now, but there will be others that will get lost, and it will be there to feed again.
Number 3. I used to be a part of Team Rocket. I was kidnapped on one of their raids. Not wanting to be imprisoned, I decided to join their ranks. Luckily, though, I never had to do anything too terrible. I did hear stories, though, of terrible things. I was on guard duty late one night, just guarding our secret base. It was just me and another rocket grunt. He was more experienced than me, and he had joined the organization because he wanted to. And he felt like sharing with me a story. A story of how Team Rocket used to breed Dittos. I've had to hold on to this story for a long time, and I feel like now I need to tell it. But I must warn you, if you don't like stories of Pokemon suffering, then I urge you not to listen. A lot of emphasis was put on Team Rocket's little science experiment, the Lake of Rage, and soon after that, their takeover of the radio tower. When all the while they had already set up a much larger, but more secretive operation. You see, the daycare man and his wife were not the first to discover that Pokemon laid eggs. The first to discover the egg was a lowly rocket grunt who was in charge of looking after all the captured Ditto. The rocket grunt, Hiroshi, thought he had the easiest job in the whole organization. Not once had he run into that 11-year-old child who had single-handedly defeated Team Rocket not even a year ago, and he was not respected enough to have his plans follow through, so he's never messed up so badly that he'd have to come face-to-face with Giovanni to explain himself. Hiroshi really did have it easy. All he had to do was make sure the Pokemon weren't too loud, and that they were generally fed, and on the rare occasion that they soiled themselves, he had to wipe it up with a rag. The Ditto were kept in squalor. Hiroshi was regularly required to electrocute them if they were not silent. However, most nights they had remained silent, with only a sad humming song that resonated down the filthy hallway. Each cage, no more than 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and an electrified mesh wire held 2 Ditto. The transformation pits also held 2 Ditto, but were 10 feet by 10 feet wide to accommodate for the shape-shifting to larger Pokemon, all controlled by electrical frequencies as to what Pokemon they became. They all sang, one after another, and as the song spread outwards, Hiroshi felt his eyes begin to flutter. He felt compassion for the creatures, cramped in their cages, or in the transformation pits. Besides, the song wasn't unpleasant to listen to, but falling asleep on guard duty was a surefire way for things to go wrong. To help keep him awake, he reached for a Pokeball. When the energy was released from the ball, an Arcanine padded forwards toward its master.
If you smell anything out of place, or if they try to escape, use whatever force you think is necessary.
The Arcanine nodded its large head and padded down to sit next to its master. With that, Hiroshi nodded his head and almost instantly fell asleep. The song continued to resonate in his dream. He felt he had not slept all of 10 minutes before he was woken up by a terrible squealing and panting. His eyes bolted open and in a panic. He scanned the battery cages and the transformation pits. The song had died, and in its place was a horrible screeching noise, as if all the Ditto began to panic at once. Hiroshi had only a split second to run to the lever and flip it down before several sparking bolts seared through the wires, causing a high squeal from the confined Ditto before they knew to be silent once more. But still, the whimpering and hushed language continued between them as they shuddered in their cages. The panting continued. Hiroshi stepped slowly along the aisle, looking inside each single cage. The Ditto stared back at him with an expression of pure fear, as they shook from cold and hunger. It was in the first transformation pit that he found his Arcanine, panting. Under him was one of the transformed Ditto, in a shape that Hiroshi did not recognize. It was dog-shaped, but it was black, with white horns from its head, and a long, whipping tail. The Ditto dog panted helplessly, while under the Arcanine, the searing pain of a forced transformation to an unfamiliar shape confused and distressed it. Arcanine gave a long, loud yelp before demounting the Ditto dog and padding back towards Hiroshi, jumping the fence with ease. Hiroshi himself was still in shock, as he watched the Pokemon shape in front of him. He had never seen anything like it before. the Ditto shape looked sickly. Many of the bones that would have been internal showed on the outside of the dog-like body. It panted again before collapsing. Hiroshi shook his head and ushered his Pokémon away. Such strange things were not uncommon to see with the transformation in pit Dittos. Sometimes, with the different currents, the Ditto changed shape into structures they had never seen before. Excited by the concept of new Pokémon, Team Rocket had tried desperately to get the Ditto to stabilize into their new forms to no avail. What disturbed Hiroshi, however, was the way in which his Arcanine had simply mounted the poor creature. In the weeks that followed, Hiroshi took care not to release any of his Pokémon from their balls when he was on Ditto duty. He paid extra attention to the dark dog Ditto, who lay sprawled on the floor of the pit, tongue lolling from its mouth, and its breathing extremely labored. A lack of food, water, and cleanliness made it look even worse than it already did. Hiroshi smirked a little bit.
You got the look of a doomed hound.
The dog Ditto looked up to him and shakily stood on its 4 legs. What happened next astounded and scared Hiroshi for the rest of his days. The Ditto dog scrunched up its face and howled in pain, causing the caged Ditto to again scream with terror. Hiroshi ran to get one of the medics, thinking that the Ditto was dying. Now that would be an offense to face Giovanni with. When they both had returned, the Ditto dog was still standing and howling inhumanly, a high-pitched squeal as its innards burst from its backside and fell into a bloody heap behind it, a large, solid mass among the awful debris. The doctor jumped into the pen immediately, but the Ditto dog had already began to dissolve, first into a pinkish, gelatinous goop, and then it began to shrink until it was nothing but liquid. The Ditto had expired, but still left on the dirt of the pit was the offal and the large mass. The doctor sifted through the offal and picked up the mass. To his surprise, it was steady in his hands, and held it up to Hiroshi. It was an egg. The egg was monitored for days on end by the scientists and Hiroshi, who took a personal interest in his big discovery, until, all at once, the news spread in the department that the egg was hatching. There was a big commotion at the department as people crowded around the small table. The egg began to shake and crack, little splinters coming off in pieces before a dark head emerged. It was disgusting. It was gruesome. It looked evil. But it was new. A puppy, black as night, with its skull seeming to be visible on the outside and its ribs protruding from its back. It was perfect. Hiroshi stepped forward, parting the crowd, his mind swimming with opportunities. If this Pokémon lived, thrived, and reproduced, then he had successfully achieved by accident what the scientists had been trying to do since the Dittos were captured. He had created a new Pokémon.
This does not look the same as the hound that was in our cage. That Ditto must have been a final evolution of this one. That Ditto was a doomed hound. Therefore, its name will be Houndoom. And this one, this is our hound. Its name will be Houndour.
The scientists nodded silently in agreement, all astounded by events which happened before them. From that moment onwards, Hiroshi was presented before Giovanni with the Houndour, and was promptly put in charge of the Ditto Evolution Project. For the next 2 years, Hiroshi studied the Ditto in the pits, forcing them into strange and grotesque shapes with the aid of the electrical current, and then forcing them to breed with the male gender of a similar-looking Pokémon. He managed to do this successfully with at least 100 different variations of the Ditto. All of them managed to give birth to eggs. Some eggs never hatched. Some eggs hatched and the Pokémon died within a few days. And some eggs hatched, but the offspring were infertile, or never evolved. But there were many eggs that hatched, and just like Houndour, they managed to successfully evolve and rebreed. After this was successful, they even tried it with Pokémon that they already knew. Pikachu Dittos had strange Minichu babies. Magmar Dittos had even stranger Minimar babies. The discovery was outstanding, but tragic as none of these offspring lived very long after the mother Ditto had expired, which led to the development of better medical care, and gradually, The Ditto could sustain more than one offspring in their lifespan, but still, the babies did not thrive. This continued for many years until word of mouth began to travel, with wealthy Pokemon collectors sporting brand new types of Pokemon. The Ditto, their eggs, and their babies were all mysteriously released one night, and Hiroshi was found dead in the labs, his body charred beyond recognition through visual means alone. Whether this was a revolt from the tortured Ditto, who just so happened to escape, or whether Pokemon activists managed to infiltrate and release the Pokemon themselves is unknown. It was several years afterwards, when many of these new species had begun to thrive in the regions of Johto and Kanto, that an old couple living just outside Goldenrod came home to a rather shocking discovery. A large, soft egg nestled between two Pokemon they were looking after. Rocket continued the project, however, with whatever Ditto they could find. Still, to this day, they are trying to manipulate them, and with a bigger gene pool than ever before, there is no end to the mutations they can force on those poor, battery Dittos.